Welcome to C-Suite Blueprint Radio, conversations with communications strategy consultant and author Ed Barks and his guests. C-Suite Blueprint Radio serves as a practical resource for senior communications and government relations executives who counsel their C-suite leaders. Our goal? To help you achieve your business and public policy goals. Now, here's your host, Ed Barks.
Tommy Goodwin is Vice President of Government Affairs for the Exhibitions and Conferences Alliance, recognized by The Hill as one of its 2020 Association top lobbyists. He also currently serves as President of the National Institute of Lobbying and Ethics, and he is the immediate past chair of the American Society of Association Executives, Government Relations, and Advocacy Professionals Advisory Council. Tommy Goodwin knows Capitol Hill and all the advocacy changes that have resulted from the pandemic. And those changes are what we're here to talk about today. Tommy, welcome.
Ed, thank you very much for having me.
We're glad you're here. A big picture question to start us off. How has the pandemic changed government relations?
Well, I think like any profession, there's been a significant amount of change. We've gone virtual. But I think for government relations, what's been particularly interesting is that when you think about some of the folks we advocate for, whether that's Capitol Hill or the administration, this has been a very large culture shock for them. This is a world that's used to in-person, face-to-face communications. You're used to in-person negotiations. You're used to being able to read body language. And now this is all digital and all virtual. And it's coming at a time where many of the elected officials that we advocate for have never been busier. And there's never been a higher stakes effort in terms of the work that is happening here in Washington, D.C. and the states. So in many ways, it has been fundamentally reshaped.
Now, how have congressional offices in particular adapted? Would most, in your experience, get an A or would they get an F?
I would give them an A because I think it's important to think about where they're starting from. I mean, these were offices that were very reliant on face-to-face communication. Very few members of Congress or their staff had laptops. It was an environment where there was always a premium on being seen by stakeholders, whether that was the members of Congress themselves or the public or their staff. And many of these, particularly in the personal offices, many of these staffers are working from their bedrooms. They don't have quite the setup. So I think all things considered, they're adapting to the new world very, very well.
And you said there was a lack generally of laptops. Has that been remediated? Have Capitol Hill offices invested in more laptops and more mobile communications?
They have. In the early stages of the pandemic, there were crates upon crates of them arriving almost daily, so that Capitol Hill almost went from being 10 years behind technology-wise to almost being on the cutting edge. So it was a sea change there, but it's been a positive development for sure.
That raises an interesting point because Capitol Hill has generally long been considered to be shall we be generous and say a few steps behind the rest of the world when it comes to technology. Have you experienced beyond those crates and crates of laptops sitting in the hallways, have there been frustrating fits and starts that you've had to deal with just to get through to certain offices?
Well, I think much like in the broader work world, I think everyone's on a continuum when it comes to technology adoption and comfort. So, I mean, there were certainly some folks, some elected officials for whom logging on to Zoom and having a video chat was definitely a new experience, but I think everyone has come up on them fairly well. And I think what's interesting is that, my colleague David Lusk from Key Advocacy reminded me recently that while Congress is never the first to embrace technology, and as you pointed out, far from it, they also aren't the first to abandon it either. So I think this new level of comfort with technology on Capitol Hill is going to be with us for a while.
Yeah, Capitol Hill has the reputation, and deservedly so, of having a relatively young staff age. I don't want to bow to the notion that young people know everything about technology as opposed to those who are a couple of generations ahead of them. But have you noticed any age difference in terms of those who have adapted to the technology? For instance, are the new staffers who may be just out of college, are they more adept than perhaps the chief of staff who's been around for 20, 30 years?
I think it's been more of a dichotomy in two ways. I think one is a staff versus member. I think most of the staff members were fairly comfortable with this technology and came up on it fairly quickly. I would say some of the elected officials themselves were a little behind on that, and I think part of it might be age. I think one of the other interesting dividing lines in terms of technology adoption and usefulness is we do have many members of Congress who represent rural areas, and for whom some of the luxuries that we take for granted, like broadband, aren't as common. So we've run into a couple of digital divide issues as well, but I think everyone is making their way through it.
And those elected officials, I'm not going to ask you to name names or to embarrass anyone. However, have there been instances where, let's say, some member of Congress is trying to connect from the back seat of a car and something either untoward or embarrassing happens?
I think we've seen a couple of instances last year in some committee meetings where I think, much like all of us, we didn't always hit mute appropriately, and maybe a few of the technology-related frustrations from that spilled forward, sometimes in fairly colorful terms. But those, at least, I think we're grateful, have been few and far between. We have definitely seen some instances in other countries, in Canada and elsewhere, where the snafus have been a little more tawdry, but thankfully on Capitol Hill things have been pretty tame.
And let's hope that maintains itself.
Indeed.
Now, in terms of you being a professional, government relations professional, somebody who in times past was on the Hill on I'm sure more than a routine basis, are you still able to visit the Hill? And when is the last time you were there?
Ed, it's been fairly episodic. The congressional offices are open for meetings. The processes have changed. So whereby you used to be able to walk into a congressional office building and make your way around unfettered. These days, you do require a staff escort. I think that's going to be with us for a little while longer, because one of the things, we've talked about the pivot to digital as a result of COVID. I think one of the things that we shouldn't forget is that about 6 months ago, the Capitol was also attacked. So security measures are still very high. The fencing around the Capitol just came down. And so it is a bit burdensome to be up on Capitol Hill right now. Most offices are operating in if not a completely virtual format, what I would call a virtual first format, where they're rotating staff members in and out, lots of Zoom meetings still to help balance some of the load. We've seen some instances where state and district-based staff have been taking issues as well, so those folks wouldn't be in the Washington, D.C. office anyway. So still very much ramping up what traditional quote-unquote advocacy has looked like. And I think one of the things that we're looking for in the weeks ahead are some firm guidelines and standards on what Hill access is going to look like going forward. And those haven't been as forthcoming as we had hoped, but hopefully within the near term, we'll be able to understand what the next iteration of normal for folks like me who walk the Hill looks like.
I want to expand on that notion of these long-lasting effects, and I'm glad you raised the security issue as well. I recall vividly after 2001, the attack on the U.S. in 2001, on September 10th of that year, I was on the Hill and I was able to walk from the Senate side to the House side underneath the Capitol through the tunnel system, and largely unfettered. That all changed the next day, and it has not relaxed since then. Do you see this security instance as serious as it may be? Some people using it as an excuse to tighten things down and limit access even further?
I think that's a very interesting question you raise. And I can say that, from my perch as the volunteer president of NILE, the National Institute for Lobbying and Ethics, we have been on the forefront of making sure that Capitol access has been restored, because it's not just for folks like me. It's for average citizens coming to Washington, D.C. for tours, for fly-ins, for the opportunity to meet directly with their lawmakers. So making sure that we have open access to Capitol Hill is critical. Now, as you mentioned, the days of being able to walk the tunnels from one side of the Hill to the other have long since passed. And I think we're probably going to be a ways away from that. But one of the really special elements about Capitol Hill is that it has always been open. Unlike other federal buildings, unlike the White House, it has always truly been the people's house. And I think that's part of culturally what makes Congress as open and responsive as it is. And I think restoring that in the somewhat near future is going to be very important, so that folks like you or I or folks like anyone who's listening to this can be able to go and petition their lawmaker for the redress of grievances.
We're talking with Tommy Goodwin here on C-Suite Blueprint Radio. A quick reminder for our listeners to keep up with the latest in communications strategy and training, become a member of the communications community. When you sign up online at barkscom.com, you receive the new research report, If You Thought 2020 Was Challenging, the Future of Professional Development in a Hybrid Working World. You'll also receive twice monthly emails to help you sharpen your communications edge. Just visit barkscom.com and tell us where to send it. Join the community today. Back now with Tommy Goodwin and our conversation about changes the pandemic has visited upon Capitol Hill advocacy. Tommy, how do all these changes affect the advocates who approach policymakers? And I'm talking about two sides of the coin that you've already addressed in some fashion. People like you who live and breathe public affairs day to day, and then those citizen advocates who may contact their elected officials periodically on behalf of their association or professional society. You mentioned it, the access has been limited largely for folks like that. What can they do now to try to increase ties between their issues and their member of Congress?
Sure. I think like many of us, Capitol Hill has certainly seen the uptick in email activity, the uptick in social media use over time. And so what's been interesting, and Brad Fitch at the Congressional Management Foundation does a really good job of laying this out, is that for the most part, congressional offices really haven't staffed up and changed their processes accordingly, really for almost 20 years or more. So it's a lot of information coming at them. It's coming hard and fast. And what is, I think, really particularly challenging is how do, as you mentioned, how do you break through, particularly as a citizen advocate? And I think there are certainly ways to do that. I think one of which is anytime you reach out to your member of Congress, really personalizing the communication, really telling your story of why you're interested in a given issue is going to be particularly compelling for them, because identical mass email campaigns have been a tactic that has been used for many, many years and is being used with lessening and lessening impact over time. I think when someone sees something that's personalized and they see that you're telling their story, they're inclined to spend the appropriate time responding to you and letting you know that they're thinking about your concerns. And I think also in this world, the messaging and the language, that whether it's a citizen advocate or a professional like myself, the messaging has to be crisper. It has to be, you have to clearly articulate what your interests are. You really need to cut to the chase. Used to be in my world, you could put together a one-page summary of a given issue and you could use that as a platform for conversation. And I don't think that's the case anymore. I think you really need to articulate to a policymaker why they should be interested, and then really almost like a traditional consumer value proposition, lay out the problem, the solution, and the reason that they should take your concerns seriously. And for organizations and associations like mine, that really requires a lot of advocate training. You just mentioned, the challenge of doing professional development in both an in-person and virtual environment. I would say the same thing holds true for advocacy, and that's why associations and organizations and issues and causes really need to make sure that they're preparing their advocates to be successful in this new environment.
Tommy, given some of the hostility, especially on the Republican side, to wearing masks and physical distancing, how safe do you feel when you venture to the Hill now?
I think it's interesting because it's very easy to paint Capitol Hill and Congress with a broad brush, but really, in all reality, it's 535 small businesses. And each office has their own rules, their own standards, the way they do business, and it varies from office to office. I think it did before COVID, and I think that's very, very true now. I think generally speaking, Capitol Hill is a fairly safe environment, particularly for folks who have been vaccinated. Even walking the halls now, it feels as though, and Ed, from your time up there, what it used to feel like walking the halls around the August recess. There were some people there, but there are just so many people who are working alternate schedules, who are still at home, some staff who've decamped away from Washington, D.C. during this time. So it is not anywhere near as crowded as it used to be. And that is something that, over time, I think will ramp back up. But for those who've taken the public health measures seriously, I think it is still a fairly safe environment, even though we have seen over time a couple of breakthrough cases and a few instances of folks who have been vaccinated catching the virus. But I think those, at least at this point, are still few and far between.
Okay, now I'm going to ask you to pull out your crystal ball. Give me your best estimate as to when we might return on the Hill to something resembling pre-pandemic conditions. If not going all the way, what's it going to look like? What's it going to feel like?
I think your piece at the end there is appropriate. I think it's going to be iterative. I don't think we're going to be getting back to a normal, but I think we're going to be seeing multiple normals over time. I think what I'm really looking to is, you remember fly-in season, sort of that period in the spring where so many organizations and associations have their advocacy conferences in DC and visit Capitol Hill. I think that's what a lot of people are really looking to as a way of normalcy returning to Capitol Hill, allowing groups of advocates to come back in safely and knowing that the Capitol and its staffers have taken the appropriate precautions to make sure that people can visit safely. So I think we'll be seeing some of that come up probably early in the new year. I think we're looking for the Hill to be opened up more broadly a little bit before then. We've seen some of the security fencing comes down. I think really now we're just waiting for the new access procedures to help us understand what that first iteration of the new normal is going to look like. But I do fear that we're probably looking early 2022 to see something that we might have seen more regularly in 2020 or before.
Tommy, what's the best way for listeners to get in touch with any questions, any follow-up they might have for you?
Well, I'm delighted to hear from anybody in your community. You can reach me on LinkedIn or Twitter. It's Tommy Goodwin, all one word, and happy to connect and dialogue with you there.
Thanks to Tommy Goodwin, Vice President of Government Affairs for the Exhibitions and Conferences Alliance and President of the National Institute of Lobbying and Ethics, for sharing his insights on today's advocacy landscape here on C-Suite Blueprint Radio. This is Ed Barks. Until next time.
Thank you for listening to C-Suite Blueprint Radio with Ed Barks. Check out the show notes on the C-Suite Blueprint blog. While you're there, comment on this episode by sharing your thoughts in the Leave a Reply box. To learn how Ed can help you reach your business and public policy goals, visit barkscom.com. That's BARKSCOMM.com. Tune in again soon here on C-Suite Blueprint Radio.